Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 16th episode of Beyond Talking Points. This is Matthew this is Matt with my co-host Matthew. So today we're going to talk about the first Sam Harris-Jordan Peterson debate that happened in Vancouver. So this was put on by Pangburn Philosophy in 2018, I believe. We decided to, since we both had seen it in the past but never had a full-on discussion about it, that it would be fun to revisit, kind of like how in the early days we analyzed the Peterson versus Zizek debate and talked about our thoughts there. So we both gave it a rewatch, and I thought it was definitely more interesting to watch it now, a couple years later, because I definitely watched it at the time. But I had a lot of different thoughts and feelings about some of the things that happened there. So we're just going to kind of go through the debate a little bit and talk about things that jumped out to us and maybe to discuss our reactions to it and see where we really disagree or where we thought, some of the debaters went wrong. So just to start from the top, one of my first notes was so the debate starts off with Peterson essentially trying to point out where him and Sam both agree on things. And it ends up turning into a conversation where Peterson is kind of grilling Sam Harris on kind of the difference between totalitarianism and religion and how dogma relates to that. And Harris kind of comes to the point that the real issue is dogmatism. To some extent, Harris admits that religion without dogma is fine, which is why he's such a proponent of spirituality. So this opened up a lot of thoughts on my end. I guess I'll just kind of give my reaction to that was that kind of encapsulates why I think a lot of Harris and Peterson's disagreements are more, how could I say this? It almost shows that their disagreements are on paper, but not necessarily that different in practice. Because a lot of Jordan Peterson's arguing isn't for the dogmatic end of religion. He's arguing about the narratives and the values those narratives can bring. And it seems to me that Jordan Peterson interprets religion without the dogma, because he's interpreting the stories and using those narratives as guides. And I don't think dogma is required to appreciate that interpretation. So, and a lot of what Jordan Peterson does is religion minus the dogmatic beliefs. So hearing that early on kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop, because it almost seemed like Harris admitting that religion minus dogma is okay should show why a lot of the things Peterson is approving of or pushing are fine. That kind of caught my eye early. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
It was certainly a moment that I didn't remember before watching the debate. I think that the difference, however, or a huge difference that I would say between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson is this: they, what they believe is objective moral truths, they think come from two different sources. So that's kind of another part of their agreement. They both agree that there are such things as moral facts, and you can be right or wrong morally, objectively speaking. And but from what I understand, Peterson, while he is a scientist and he's familiar with the scientific method, or at least partly a scientist, he views these age-old religious stories as the key to objective moral truth, whereas Harris thinks that you can get objective moral truth through the scientific method itself. And if you've read The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris, which I have read, he makes it clear that you can people tend to think that, science tells you what things are, not how things should be, and Sam Harris basically flips that on its head and says, no, it can tell you how things should be.
I thought that part was kind of interesting because, I guess the reason, just to circle back to what I had brought up, that specific moment, it showed that they do have some disagreements, but it kind of pushed it away from being their disagreement isn't as much on the utility of religion as it seems at first, because Harris early on kind of cedes the point that religion could be okay if it's not dogmatic, and that was a concession I didn't expect. But to talk about their differences in terms of like how they how they kind of post objective truth on something. Harris pretty much says you can deduce intuition, and it was kind of weird because it was a lot of philosopher speak in the sense that he's saying something that's definitionally true, because his whole premise of what, as Jordan Peterson kept calling it, hell. He kept pretty much saying something that verbally can't be untrue because of the words he picked. Because he's pretty much saying the worst thing for any person is obviously bad because it's the worst thing possible for every person. So it's like that sentence is in itself true because of the word choice. So if those words mean anything, it follows that it's true. And he does go about it in that way, while Peterson kind of later talks about how he essentially surveyed 6 fields and then said if there's overlap in these 6 very distinct fields in terms of something being moral or immoral, it's likely that is universally true to some extent. So you end up getting the difference between Sam Harris relying on intuition and Peterson, talking about, several different fields. Do you want to add more on that?
Something that I would like to bring up is a topic that we've talked about on this very podcast before. I do consider myself a moral realist. I do think there are such things as objective moral truths. So in this sense, I agree with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, but I would veer more towards Sam Harris's intuitions, and I would say that I would not say that the objective moral truths are fundamentally based on these timeless religious stories. And I would say it is. You can do it more through science and philosophy and other secular means. You can find it through science and philosophy and other secular means. I don't know how if you want to go down that rabbit hole again. We kind of had this conversation once before, like I said, but I just wanted to lay that down. As a point, yeah.
So when I think of this, I guess I found this issue compelling, more or less compelling, depending on my mood or my interest at the time. Because right now, when you throw that question out there, to me, it's not the most compelling. I think I find myself just based on hearing their debate. I feel like Harris is saying something that's definitionally true, so I don't think he's wrong, right? If you spell it out in the way he spells it, you can't really disagree with him in any compelling way. So I think where I just start to lose Harris in general is when we talk about the utility of stories, or if there could have ever been utility of stories, and then viewing things as a narrative, like or the framework in which you analyze things. I think that's where I end up siding more with Jordan. But on that point that you just mentioned, I think I am more in the Harris camp. Although I do think people generally who would consider themselves objectivists, but not really philosophical. People who aren't that philosophically oriented will call themselves objective, and they'll call a lot of things objective that are very subjective, and that's why I always hedge against it. But I don't know enough about people who are not objectivists to really stake out a claim right now. But if I had to pick between Harris and Peterson, I found Harris more compelling in the debate on this point. I guess to close that loop.
Well, I kind of brought it up because I remember at least a couple podcasts ago you had said that you considered yourself, you did not believe in moral objectivism, and you thought that all morals were subjective. So that's kind of why I brought it up.
Well,
I mean, it sounds like you kind of maybe slightly changed your mind, or not perhaps changed your mind, but kind of moderated your position a bit.
Well, so I guess in the very loosest ways you can make objective claims. I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at. So if you define something that, if you think the words mean anything is true, like if you said, imagine the worst thing for everybody possible, then that would obviously be bad because it's the worst scenario for every person to be living in. But then even something that all of everybody in Western civilization would agree is bad, I don't know if you can call it objectively bad, because you could imagine somebody. I could imagine somebody being born somehow with a brain that has the opposite intuitions of all of us, and then that person says, "Oh, I don't get how that's bad," and I find it hard to claim a reason why it's bad other than things that are rooted in my intuitions, right? So I don't know how to determine the validity of my own intuitions opposed to somebody else's intuitions. So I can imagine a world where somebody has the opposite intuitions as me, and then suddenly I can't appeal to the thing that seems so true to me as a normal human in the 21st century, but I feel right, and everybody around me would agree they're right. But does that mean they're wrong? I guess that's why I hedge.
Should I, or would you like me to maybe give you my general arguments in favor of moral objectivism, or do you kind of want to just put this aside and continue on with
No,
other parts of the debate?
if you want to give a couple minutes on how to address that kind of hypothetical I laid out there, how you would confront that, I'm fine with that. I just might not have a lot in rebuttal, and then we could just move on anyways. So yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm actually reminded, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I also, another debate which might be interesting to talk about sometime, was a debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault, the late Michel Foucault, because they were talking about things like, how do you derive morality, what's the ideal political system, and Noam Chomsky was a moral realist, and Michel Foucault, who is was influential in postmodern philosophy, post-structuralist philosophy. He was saying, no, there really are no objective moral truths, and they basically had two very different epistemological foundations. As Chomsky was more like Harris in that he was grounded in the empirical sciences, and Foucault was more about he saw that even the empirical sciences had certain intuitions behind them that in other centuries wouldn't make sense to people, and so you can't say, oh, this is objectively true. You just have to say, given these intuitions, given these presuppositions, this is what you come up with. Given different presuppositions, you come up with something different. So I think that there are such things as moral truths just because human nature exists. And that's another thing that Michel Foucault didn't acknowledge human nature existed. He said, no, there isn't human nature. There are only humans. But I think if you're going to take a biological approach to studying mankind, or if you're going to acknowledge that we are biological organisms, then there must be a nature of some sort. And so I think if you acknowledge that there is such a thing as human nature, I think that means that there are you can treat a human in healthy ways or unhealthy ways, or constructive ways and destructive ways. So within the bounds of human relations, I do think there is such a thing as moral truths. Now, that doesn't mean that they're written in the stars as such. So I guess what I'm trying to say is morality is, it can be true even if it is constructed by people.
Yeah, I might have to watch the debate, because I've heard I'm familiar with Thaddeus Russell's work, and he is like I don't know if he considers him an anarchist or libertarian, but he references Foucault a lot. And a lot of what I guess what I'm saying is I've heard people defend Foucault, and I wasn't uniquely moved by what you just said. not to be rude about it or anything, but I could see somebody saying, just, you can't really have an overall human nature, given that, although there are common traits, not every trait is the same from human to human. So how much of that would you call the human trait? And then in my scenario, where you can imagine sociopaths or certain people with certain neuroatypical disorders, those people are still people, but they might have completely different intuitions because of those things. And because of those intuitions are different and they're uncommon doesn't necessarily make them untrue. So appealing to human nature when people are different, I kind of move to reject that collectivist notion, even though I know that there are commonalities between people. I'm obviously not claiming that. I'm not claiming that a ton of people don't share our Western intuitions that you and I both have, and Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson all have. Like, I definitely share those intuitions, but calling that endemic to human nature when we know there are some humans that don't inherent and innately share those values doesn't invalidate those people. You're kind of just saying those people don't count because they aren't representative of the overall population. But if you're acknowledging that there can be exceptions, then I don't think you can say it's human nature if it doesn't apply to all humans. So I think my hypothetical still stands. If somebody has all these different intuitions, because that does happen, then how do I claim that they're wrong when I'm appealing to my own intuition just because there's more people like me?
I don't know. I mean, there's just so much I could say now. Could I say a little more? I feel the need to answer some of those objections. Okay, so am I saying that someone who's not neurotypical doesn't matter? Am I saying that a sociopath or a psychopath or anyone who might not be perceived as normal, am I saying those people don't matter? Absolutely not. But here's the thing. I mean, if we're not these, this kind of goes back to something else that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson were talking about. Jordan Peterson was bringing up primate violence, to kind of show that, or to kind of explain to Sam Harris, okay, we're not really necessarily these rational beings that you think we are. We have these perhaps undesirable instincts that can make people do terrible things. And of course, that he goes on to say, to try to explain why that kind of supports his defense of religion. But so the question, therefore, then is this: how separated are we from nature, and how interlinked? How much are we linked to nature? And the idea that we just don't have a human nature. I mean, I guess I can understand why people say that, but I just my eyes glaze over when people say things like that.
I'm not rejecting the concept of humans have certain predispositions born into them. I'm not rejecting that. I'm just rejecting that humans could be the same because they're humans. Like even if you're born into certain predispositions, it doesn't mean that there is a collective human nature that applies to everybody. And I think that's the problem. Since there's exceptions, I find it hard to pin down one moral truth.
Well, no. I mean, it does mean there's a collective human nature because, again, we're not these mystic beings that just kind of. I mean, as anyone who listens to this podcast know, I'm not a religious person, so I don't believe. If you have religious presuppositions, I think you can say that. But I don't think for someone like me who has materialist presuppositions and believes in the empirical sciences, or is persuaded that the empirical sciences are what constitute objective truth, you can't say, well, just because people are different doesn't mean there's not a collective human nature. There can be slight variations and still be a collective human nature.
Well, I guess I'm not saying slight variations though. Like a lot of people come to completely different conclusions about very, very important things, like when violence is okay and all these kinds of things like that. That it'd be easy to say these things are obviously bad, but then people can come to very stark conclusions about when violence is bad and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of people's reactions to say things that are genetically deep in us, like evolutionarily, like people in our in-group, like specifically family members being harmed would incite certain responses in them. All that stuff is definitely, built into your human nature. But that's not to say that there aren't exceptions, which is why I say you can't say something is objectively true when there are clearly, exceptions that come up here and there. And if you do claim that some things are objectively true, then it's almost like, how narrowly do you have to define it to where there aren't objections that are not inherently invalid? But I don't know if there's more we want to go down on that road, or if we want to jump into a completely different part of their debate, because I have a few notes that are kind of like really unrelated, and I think one of them you're gonna have a lot to say on.
I'll just say, like, I'll just spend one more minute on this, and then we can move on. I mean, look, it's just because, again, just because there's even vast variation among human beings or among any species, that doesn't mean that there isn't a way you can make you can make some generalizations which are empirically verifiable, so that help you understand what it is to be a human being or a chimpanzee or a gnat. So yeah, I mean, people are different. You and I aren't the same person, but that doesn't mean that you and I are still human. And so that means we have to share a certain qualities, and not just superficial ones, like we're both apes, other deep-seated ones, psychological ones. That's my point. That there's even a common psychological reservoir that we sort of all draw from. Jordan Peterson would probably appreciate that, because he's a big fan of Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious. But we can move on.
Yeah, I do think that despite us just going on that 6-minute tangent, or however long on that, it makes it seem like we disagree a lot, and I don't think we do. But I think we could what's the word for it? Hash that out properly if we spent more time on it in like a more compelling way. But I don't think you're wrong. I just think we come to a different conclusion based on things we agree on. And I think we're getting bogged down in trying to argue with the setup. But I'm going to move on to something completely different, because this really caught my interest. And I know it's something that I feel like you're totally on Harris's side for. And I don't know why I felt like I had an epiphany when I was listening to it. But so Sam Harris starts talking very narrowly about interpreting the Bible. And he kind of says, obviously, the fundamentalists are right because they're literally reading the words off the page. So the fundamentalists are always ahead because you can just read the words, that's how it is. And then people like Jordan Peterson are reading in other stuff, and people can just read in whatever they want. So Jordan Peterson essentially responds with, well, it can be complex. You have to understand it in the context of everything. And it's a story. It's a narrative. And just like how you watch a movie, knowing something at the end of the movie can shine light on stuff at the beginning of it. So how do you deal with this? And it really kind of bothered me, I guess, the more I thought about it, how Harris defaults to the assumption that the book is supposed to be literal and not in the narrative form. Because it can seem very clear, like from people who experience those really bad, short videos of stories from the Bible, that they're a narrative. It's a story. Here's what happens in the story. And a lot of people like Dawkins and Harris will narrowly point out things that are clearly ridiculous sounding to us. And it'll be like a paragraph in the Bible. But I think there is a argument to be made that since it is a narrative structure, you can't just take one sentence from it and then deconstruct that sentence if you have to appreciate the sentence in the context of about a dozen different things. So I guess what I'm criticizing in general is Harris defaulting to assuming the Bible is literal as if that's obviously true, and that's obviously the correct way to interpret it. And I guess I'm also harping in on how Jordan Peterson chose to defend using context and how important that is. So I feel like you're going to have strong thoughts on this, so I kind of want you to get at it. And if you don't end up, you can defer back to me. By
the way, I'm getting a little like feedback from your mic, so I don't know you might want to turn it down a little. Okay, so I'll try to. I've noticed. I was thinking about this. In some of the podcasts, when I talk about religion, I feel like I end up harping on Islam. So I hope to, and before this podcast, but for this particular podcast, just to focus a little more on Judaism and Christianity, especially Christianity, because that is really the religion I know the most of. So don't forget to remind me to do that. Well, look, here's the thing. You can't. I was watching an interview with a Muslim woman, and I don't think she said she calls herself a Muslim and a feminist, not a Muslim feminist. But anyway, she was saying that, well, if you call yourself a Muslim, you're a Muslim. And I mean, I have no problem with that. I mean, if someone calls himself a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or a Buddhist, okay, you have to take them at their face value. You have to. No one can really tell anyone what it means to be, a person of a particular religion, because even people within that tradition don't agree about what it means to be a part of that tradition. I think Harris's point is only that if you go back to the history, if you go back to the beginning of these religions, or of most of these religions, particularly the Abrahamic monotheistic religions, they began with a very dogmatic, literalist interpretation of their religion. And of course, Harris would argue that, those people are the true, they're the true example of that religion, and the people who take it more moderately or don't take everything literally, those people are, more watered down version of that religion. And I mean, I agree with this. Now the issue, of course, comes in with strategy. Like, strategically, I side with the moderate religious people, but in terms of their honesty, in terms of their intellectual honesty, I appreciate the fundamentalists more, for the very reason that that, as Sam said, you can look at the text, and there are even Brett Weinstein, who is not completely who was kind of right in the middle between Sam and Peterson. Even Brett Weinstein said there are some parts of that text that are just inexcusable. There's no moral reason for it. You can't say. I mean, just one example that comes off the top of my head that I don't think they talked about in the debate is the story about Abraham and Isaac. Now, in case anyone doesn't know, the Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son for God, and he's about to do it too. Only God steadies his hand and says, "No. You don't need to sacrifice your son. I appreciate. I mean, I applaud you for being so zealous that you would sacrifice your son, but you don't have to sacrifice your son." Now, that is, I would say, that's a profoundly immoral story, because it's saying, oh, you have to be prepared. It doesn't matter if he did it or not. You have to be prepared to do pretty much anything for God. And anyone who's prepared to do almost anything for God is bound to behave immorally at some point or another. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not completely, well, I guess I was more in your camp before I listened to this debate. And then I really refrained from, I guess, siding with that, just because the complete context, it can be interpreted in a very broad way. So here's the thing. I kind of, the way I convinced myself is because I don't believe in any of these religions. I'm very agnostic, atheist, don't really care. So I kind of thought if you stipulated that God would talk to people and have those people transcribe his thoughts, that would be general guidance for the human race over some period of time, what would that look like? And I thought, well, maybe it would look something like a set of stories that have values, but the people they're spoken to are obviously it's going to be spoken down to them in ways they can understand it. And the ways they understand it are going to be archaic as the book ages. Because if God, hypothetically, was speaking to people, then he's going to give them words in a way that they would understand it. So a lot of the stories that are going to talk about doing horrible things, like, doing sacrifices that involve killing people when nobody thinks that's acceptable anymore. Well, maybe us interpreting it now should say, well, the point isn't that they're killing the people as a sacrifice. The point is they're making a sacrifice. And at this time, sacrificing humans is normal. I think that's actually a very legitimate point to make, because in the hypothetical that God gives people a book, then the book is going to be timeless in terms of the values, but it's impossible for it to be transcendent throughout time, because if God gave a manual of everything that could possibly be imagined in the human race through millennia and millions of years, it would be a book that'd be, completely full. So there is a way to interpret it as all these things that seem dumb to us are shorthand, because if you interpret them broadly, they can have a broad meaning. Now, I used to think, well, that's obviously a cop-out, but I don't see how that's a cop-out, because I think if you bought into God giving people a book, that'd be the game theory behind getting it put down in the first place. It would have to start somewhere, and it's not going to start at the end. And there are things that we're doing now that are going to seem archaic to people in 3,000 years, and that book is going to inevitably be, a problem of its time. So when you interpret it as in, this is a story, this section of the Bible is about this part, and here's a weird ritual that talks about killing people here, that's obviously wrong to all of us. The Bible condones killing people. It's like, well, that killing people can be interpreted as not the Bible condoning killing people, but it can be condoning the sacrifices that people make to a God at the time. I don't see what's that unreasonable about that point. And you have to put yourself, though, in the position of, if I believed in the Bible and thought it was the word of God, here's how this makes sense. I don't see how that's a cop-out, though. I think that's a genuine interpretation.
Alrighty. Well, I'm probably going to be taking off the kid gloves here and just rip apart your argument and see where it goes. No offense. Okay, so this is what obviously that is just, that thought experiment. I appreciate that thought experiment. But I would just say that historically speaking, that is that never happened. And I know that might sound like, oh, that's a silly, or that's an obvious point to make. But the Bible, for example, was composed over many years. Mostly what we know of the Bible today, in fact, was composed by a committee. I think it was in England. But there were books in the Bible that were taken out, books that they were put back in. Certain books were labeled heresy. So it's only if you look at the history, it's very obvious that the book is man-made. Okay. Second point. What I would, I guess, broadly define as humanism, although that's kind of the word's a bit more. It has maybe comes with a few more connotations I'm not trying to invoke, but humanism, or secular thought and philosophy and the empirical sciences, they're able to correct themselves, and they are. No one is preaching. Empirical sciences and philosophy don't have that dogma. What's the difference between philosophy and theology? Philosophy starts with questions. Theology starts with answers. It's very dangerous to start with answers, because then you are constantly trying to justify your answers and trying to torture the evidence to fit that answer, to make sure you get the answer you want to get. Now, as Sam Harris said, if we look at the history of these religions, they were forced by outside sources. It was the why in some sense does Sam Harris often pick on Islam, or why does he often end up talking about Islam or criticizing Islam? And you would say, well, because at some level, again, to quote Weinstein, that Islam has been slower to evolve and adapt over time. That's a bit complicated because, of course, Islam, or the Muslim world, actually had a version of the Enlightenment before the Europe did. But sorry, I'm stuttering. The Christian world, for example, was a barbaric place. You can think of the Inquisition, where people were literally killed because they disagreed about this particular piece of dogma or that particular piece of dogma. You have the Crusades. Now, there were obviously some material circumstances, as everything has material circumstances behind the Crusades, but part of it was also dogma. We're going to get the Jerusalem back from those dirty Muslims. And so you just look at history. The church has been against evolution. It was against it was against improvements in philosophy. The Catholic Church, for example, literally had a banned books list. No true Catholic could read these books because these books contradict that page of the Bible or this decree by the Pope. So, and I'm just imagining, what someone could say, who was playing devil's advocate, and they could say, well, Matthew, again, everyone's acknowledging the dogma's bad, but but as long as you don't have the dogma, religion's fine. Okay, but the thing is, that the particular religions that we've been talking about, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, more Islam and Christianity, I would say, they have never been without dogma, and I don't think those particular religions will ever be without dogma, and that is why they are so dangerous.
So I think we got really off topic there. I mean, I was pretty much claiming that there is, I think, a compelling reason to think that books shouldn't inherently be, interpreted literally. So I understand that they picked and choose different books from the Bible, discarded some, decided that some things should not be canonical when they probably should be, and that all these books are written at different times. I understand that, but I guess what I was hypothesizing was, if we were supposed to believe the whole thing is the Word of God, wouldn't it follow that there is a scenario where it would make sense to let it still be a bit archaic and not be a timeless document, and just have the morals be timeless, because you can look at the morals in form of the narrative. The fact that the church has done kind of bad things can just show there can be bad readings of the scripture. Now, the cool thing is, here's the thing. I think you're trying to assume I'm defending religion as a whole when I say these things. I'm not. I don't care about religion at all. I'm just saying these are points that I think are holes in what Harris is saying. I think there could be an ideal, optimal reading of the Bible, just like there is of any piece of literature. Because some people could read Catcher in the Rye and decide to go murder a member of the Beatles, and some people can read it as a story that has some values about growing up, has some values about nihilism. You can learn things here and there. You can interpret his narrative and his story, and garner things that you can use in your own life, or maybe reevaluate certain things that have happened to you. Not every reading of that book is equal. And you can easily say that applies to the Bible, because the Bible is narrative that has certain values supposed in each of its stories. I don't see why that's so unreasonable, and you don't have to defend the fact that the church has had people, get murdered for heresy. It's like, yeah, those people were evil, but then you could just say they were interpreting the Bible in a silly way. And I'm not saying that to excuse those religious murders and those dogmatic murders. I'm just saying there could hypothetically be a correct reading of the Bible, and unfortunately, it might not be the mainstream version that has existed throughout history, right? I guess that's what I'm getting at, because it seemed like you did a full-throated attack on all of religious history, and that's fine, because a lot of institutions that were religious have done terrible things. That's not an unreasonable thing to say, that people have used it to, further their authoritarianism, and whatever their ends were, and they've used it as a weapon or a way to control people. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying, if you want to treat the Bible, as an academic piece of literature, and you wanted to view it in, a more favorable light, there could be a way of viewing it that looks at its narrative structure and derives the value from that. And just because it might not be done historically that way doesn't mean it's wrong. And I think that's the point Peterson's trying to get it across. He's not saying people have historically done it. They get in the big argument at the end. But he's just saying this is still a good way to use it, even if it's not the most famous way.
Well, no, I mean, I don't mean, don't take my anger, as I'm not directing it at you. Or if I sound angry, it's my anger with the evils that have been done by religion. It's not you. Just to be clear. And my brain just.
I have a very relevant point to this that I noticed at the end, and as you were talking before, I thought this ties in, and I wanted to bring it up. So near the end of the debate, there's a moment where, of course, Brett wants to talk about the idea of it was played up for comedy, but because Sam kind of says, "Why would a God care about you masturbating?" And then Brett has to kind of jump in on that and say, "Well, let's actually talk about that." But pretty much, Brett kind of argues that there could be an evolutionary reason for the idea of a God telling people not to masturbate, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. I think we can all put the pieces together on why an evolutionarily functional society would, maybe not want people to do that because it could increase their drive, and then maybe they could find a mate. So then Sam said, well, why don't we just educate people with reason? Why don't we just tell them not to do it? Because here's some good reasons to do that, and that will evolutionarily, further our species. And then Jordan Peterson says what I thought was great. He said, some people are more amenable to dogma than reason. So I think this is a very important point to reckon with. Not everybody is going to think about things a lot if it doesn't directly affect them. Not everybody has a person in their life that can explain the right thing to do to them. But a lot of people can have access to very basic stories that 5-year-olds can understand in a daycare, when they're shown them. And then those kids can derive values from stories, as you can see in like the most basic stories possible, like hero myths. So I guess maybe we should talk about why maybe I don't think reason is a great tool, because a lot of people aren't reasonable, or maybe are not able to grasp it on a reasonable level. But a lot of people have access to these very basic stories.
Yeah, well, I just needed a second. My brain just kind of stopped functioning for a second, but now I figured out what I was going to say. And I will address that point as well. I don't care. In fact, I approve of the Bible as literature. I haven't read the whole Bible, but I've read parts of the Bible, and I've read biblical criticism, and I have no problem whatsoever if someone wants to look at the Bible from a historical and a literary lens and try to understand, the nuances of the text and try to understand what the authors of the Bible, what they meant. That's good and that's fine, and I think that's very, very valuable. I think knowledge of the Bible is important, and I get a lot out of it from learning about the Bible and reading biblical criticism. And I like to read a lot, so I really do like literary criticism and textual analysis. The thing is, though, the Bible, a lot of people do not look at the Bible and just think of it as a scholarly document and say, okay, you don't take this literally. It's just it's a work of art. It's a work of fiction, and you got to interpret it that way. That's the thing. That would be the difference between the Bible and The Catcher in the Rye. No one is trying to justify political ends with The Catcher in the Rye. No one is using The Catcher in the Rye to try to ban stem cell research. No one is using The Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky to argue that Jesus is the second coming of Christ is going to happen in our lifetime. So that's the thing is people are not. There are more people that believe the Bible is either literally the Word of God, which again doesn't make any sense based on the history of it, and they use that justification to or they use that justification to fight evolution. They say, oh, evolution isn't true because of what the Bible says. They almost done. They use the Bible as a substitute for education and use the Bible as a substitute for all these other modes of thinking and understanding, which they don't use with a work of art. Go ahead.
So I appreciate all those things in the sense that it's nice to hear you fired up and raving about something. But in the context of us discussing the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debate, I don't know if anything you just said is particularly helpful, because they admit in the first opening 10 minutes that neither of them is a fan of dogmatism, and then that Jordan Peterson isn't looking at religion, and he's not defending that. And he admits to not defending that. So it's like if we were talking about Dinesh D'Souza debating like Sam Harris or something, or Dinesh D'Souza versus Christopher Hitchens, something like that, then yeah, everything you'd said would be completely valid. But I'm not taking that stance because Jordan Peterson isn't taking that stance either. Now, I guess the point you can pivot from me saying that is you can pivot to, well, yeah, but Jordan Peterson's defending narratives that come from this book. This book is essentially tainted because it's been interpreted as a work of fact instead of a work of fiction. And since it's been tainted in such a way, Jordan Peterson is maybe giving it too much credibility. Now, I have a funny thought, which is a great throwback thought, because we talked about that Peterson-Zizek debate. And Peterson really hated that Zizek called himself a Marxist, even though he wouldn't defend the Communist Manifesto. And in this debate, it felt like Harris really hated that Jordan Peterson wouldn't outright denounce religion, even though he wouldn't consider himself a dogmatic follower of religion. So I think Jordan Peterson's argument against Zizek, saying the Communist Manifesto is so tainted for all these reasons, why don't you just drop calling yourself a Marxist, would also apply to something Harris could say to Peterson there. I think that'd be valid. So I think that's how your point could be related. But overall, though, if you subtract away that, I don't know if you're getting at a broader thing. Or I don't know if you have any thoughts on what I just said.
The reason I'm harping on dogma, I mean, there's the historical reason. Never mind what, I mean, yeah, that's fine. Peterson doesn't have to defend dogma. That's fine, and I can admit that. But you can't have a conversation about religion without addressing the dogma. And here's the thing that all these liberal Christians that I end up interacting with, or just seeing them interact with other people on debates and on the internet and whatnot, they bring a respectability to something that I don't think is respectable. That is believing in something without evidence, and so that's the funny thing. It's like people say, well, you can't judge religion by its fundamentalists. It's like, okay, but if you're these liberal Christians or these moderate Jews or moderate Muslims, well, Judaism is slightly different, but they bring they bring religion to the table, without they try basically to dust it off, and and try to they pick and choose, they cherry pick, and they're like, well, this is the true religion, this moderate form where you're not going out and and frying heretics, you're just going to church and praying maybe a little, and this is the true religion, just calm down. It's like that's just I think that's silly. And that's they in some sense I have a big disdain for those moderate religious people for that reason. But I'd like to touch a little bit on the question about rationality. Okay. So are people, fundamentally rational, or are they fundamentally irrational? And this, this isn't, this question is probably as old as, as people themselves, because, when you have someone when you have the Enlightenment, and I consider myself, as cliche as it might sound, a firm defender of the Enlightenment and a firm defender of most Enlightenment philosophers. What was their main shtick? Their main shtick was you can you can improve society, you can help people if you by using reason and by not taking things for granted. You can truly make the world a better place if you are able to question, if you're just able to pose the questions, if you're just able to ask questions and think to yourself, well, is this true, or are there better answers than this? And so to be a human being means you have goes back to the human nature thing. We have a rational part of ourselves and an irrational part of ourselves. And while you're never going to get rid of the irrational part of the human, and it's a terrible idea to even try. One could say that some Marxists attempted this. That rational part of people is there, and it can definitely assist in ways that I think Jordan Peterson doesn't appreciate.
I don't know if I know where you're going with this, with that thought of rationality versus irrationality, but I think it might be because I feel like to have a discussion on that, I need what is considered rational defined in a more narrow way, because I think a lot of things can be argued are rational given a lot of circumstances. So like a lot of literature on economics, you know how there's those like pop political science books that are like written by, pundits, and there's a lot of pop economic books that are kind of written by, an economics gets a mainstream book deal and it's great and he blows up huge. And there's a guy named Dan Ariely, and he talks about how like our minds can be inconsistent a lot. And he uses the word irrationality in a way I don't necessarily like. Like there are some ways where it's like, sure, maybe we shouldn't, like he gives the example of why people, and I think Sweden there are way more registered organ donors there compared to the United States. And it's because in Sweden, you're defaulted into being an organ donor. So they have like a 93% organ donor rate. And here we got like a 13% because you have to opt in. So he'll say, oh, it's not really, reflecting what people want. It's just like this irrational, do I have to opt into it because that makes it harder? Now, so sometimes I kind of get how you could see that as irrational, but he's definitely called things irrational that I wouldn't consider irrational. For example, people overreact to losses as opposed to gains. It's like if you took $20 from me, I'm more likely to be upset than the inverse, which is like I'd be more upset by you taking $20 than I would be happy if you gave me $20, right? I don't think that's inherently irrational just because they're not equal. I don't know why they would have to be equal, because losses and gains are different. So I feel like I need rational behavior narrowly defined for me to, I think, grasp your point.
I would. if you think about Western civilization, a big concept, a big buzzword, what is Western civilization, the downfall of Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera. If you take Western civilization, it has two, or I guess you could say three, major influences. So there's the Judeo-Christian influence. There is the Greek influence, and there is the Roman influence. And the ancient Greeks, I mean, there's a lot to pick apart. And, the ancient Greeks had slaves. There was a lot of, the world wasn't perfect back then in ancient Greece. But one thing that the ancient Greeks, for some reason, and I'm not even quite sure why this is, but for some reason, they really laid the foundation for all of rational argument, all of forms of knowledge. I mean, of course, they got some of it from, I guess, Egypt and the Persians, but they really codified it, and they really improved it in such a way that we really haven't seen. We never saw before or since. And so, when I say reason, I mean the ability to use the ability to look at the world critically, the ability to ask questions, the ability to come up with experiments and fulfill those experiments, and the ability to interpret data. Does that clear it up a bit more? Or?
Yeah. So you're talking more about just the value of being able to, think, I guess, that think in a critical manner. Okay. I understand the utility of that. I know we're kind of starting to run short on time. So there's one thing that I think ties into talking about reason in general, and it's Peterson and Harris have they kind of argue a bit on their views of an interpretive framework and how you should go about interpreting the infinite number of facts in the world. So I guess the way that I would interpret both their views is Harris pretty much says to, you base your interpretation off fundamental sanities, your intuitions, and it's kind of obvious, I guess. But Peterson kind of, he harkens back to narrative. Did you have thoughts on their discussion on interpretive frameworks that you want to dive into?
I mean, do you have more, do you have something specifically you want to mention, or?
Well, so I think this is a really important point, because one thing that kind of bothers me when I talk to people who are borderline technocratic in their thinking is that they have this weird belief that if you put the same set of facts in front of different people who are both smart, they'll come to the same conclusions. And that obviously isn't true in any capacity, because people, interpret things in a very different light. Because they value different things differently. They care about different facts more. Like when we discuss politics, we're both, trying to come to our own reasonable conclusions, but I obviously weigh individual freedom far more than the average person, because I think it's almost, I view it as a principle, and a lot of people don't think of it as a complete principle to base their rules by. But we have the same operating facts of the world. Now, so that's always just a broad thing I've thought about, and that's not even really hearkening on their interpretations of it. But I think interpretive frameworks as a concept are really important, because it completely destroys that notion of, you can have a technocrat who's smart and he'll make the right choice. It's like you can't, because you need values to shape it. And then I guess they're talking about, where do you get those values from? And then that came to what we started the podcast with Peterson saying narratives and Harris saying intuitions. So, yeah.
I mean, I think it kind of depends on how one views, or the one's epistemological presuppositions. So, as I said, Michel Foucault would really not say to you, things that we consider scientific truth, such as the Earth revolves around the sun, or humans derive from evolution by natural selection. He would just say, using the interpretive framework that we have, that empirical sciences have now, they would say the Earth revolves around the sun and evolution by natural selection is a fact. I would not say that. I would say it is a fact that the Earth revolves around the sun. It is a fact that evolution by natural selection is a fact. And so there are certain things that are just true, objectively true, and universally. And then there are other things, like the meaning of, a piece of literature, the meaning of the Bible. I would not say you can really come to objective interpretations of that. So it really depends on what you're talking about and what frame of reference you're using.
Well, I think your lens, your interpretive framework is very important to determining all of the individual's actions. I mean, I would shy away from talking about things like scientific and arithmetic truths, even though I don't know if we 100% agree on that. But it's just so we could talk about the like for you to take an individual action based on your perception of your life and all of these things, you're going to interpret it in your own way. But somebody else who could be in your shoes could say, "Oh, here's what I'm working with," and then decide to go a completely different path with things. It's where do we derive those values from that shape our human action? And then Peterson says narrative, and I think that's really compelling because he's talking about, I guess, the virtues that are instilled in us, or what we should value in life, which is things like, stability or family structure or achieving our potential. And I think that explains why he delves so much into those topics in a lot of his work. And I definitely don't want to get bogged down into Foucault in this episode, but you talking about it, I think we might need to talk about it in a future episode. So we might need to find a debate he was in, because I think you might have unintentionally said things while quoting him that actually made a lot of sense to me. So, and I know you weren't defending his point. So that's an aside that maybe we can tackle that in the future. Okay. Is there anything else from the debate as a whole that you want to try to chime in on, or just throw some thoughts on? Even if maybe we don't have time to go into a full-on discussion before we kind of wrap up, because I know you have a list of things and I don't know what we have hit and haven't hit on your list.
Well, I mean, there really was so much. You really can't talk about the whole debate in an hour. Maybe I guess I could just lay down a couple ideas that we could cover in another episode. The idea of maybe literal versus metaphorical truth is something I find compelling to talk about. When near the end, where Peterson was talking about his definition of what God is, that's definitely something I would like to tackle. There's also there's something, I don't know if you've heard of it, called death of God theology. That kind of that's a very interesting way to view the theology and religion, and that's kind of something I would like to tackle sometime as well. No, we barely didn't start my list, but that's just because there's so much in that debate, and you can really talk about it for hours.
Yeah, and I suspect, I glossed over a lot of the main stuff they talked about, especially in the beginning, because it's not that I didn't feel strongly about it, but I didn't necessarily feel like there was going to be a lot of tensions between us on them. I felt like it'd be more interesting to talk about, the interpretations of how literally you should take the Bible. I thought that we'd have more of a substantive disagreement on than the whole concept of truth. And because I could suspect what your view is of that, I think you'd probably think the word metaphorical invalidates the word that it proceeds, because if it's metaphorical, then it can't really be true, maybe. So I don't know how much we'd actually come to disagreements on some of those topics. But yeah, we can always unpack those in the future, maybe talk about which one of those we might have the most compelling disagreements on. I think we hit a lot of things, though, that we definitely were not in line on. I mean, but to some extent, we both do agree that dogmatism is generally bad, much like how Harris and Peterson started by saying they disagree. I mean, they agreed on things for about 8 to 10 minutes. So I think we have at least that much in common, if not more so, because I'm definitely not defending Peterson, 100%, probably like 80%. So
that's fair. Yeah, no, I think no, I kind of, well, one reason I enjoy doing these podcasts is kind of to like explore, like it's very fascinating to see what areas we do overlap and then what ones we just completely are an anathema to each other.
Yeah, we completely talk past each other sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
But to some extent, that reveals something about ourselves that we might not have known, is that we aren't maybe potentially able to come from the same perspective on some things, and that might be a blind spot I have or you have. It's just not being able to maybe at this point in our lives empathize with that perspective right now.
And that's the kind of the nice thing about podcasts in general, is you just put two people, and you just have two people kind of have a conversation, and the audience, more than anyone else, more than perhaps even the people having the discussion or the debate, the audience is able to see, well, I think this is where this person has a blind spot, or this is where that person has a blind spot, or this is, where they were talking past each other, or this is where, they were actually making substantive progress in their discussion. And so I hope it's enjoyable to those who are listening.
Yeah, and that definitely can be said. Yeah, that could definitely be said for a lot of podcasts I listen to, because I listen to a lot of stuff I don't necessarily agree with, and it's like, well, I need to check out other people's blind spots, and I need to make sure I'm, taking into account stuff that I'm not predisposed to care about. But I think we covered that, at least to some extent. That was our hour-ish attempt to tackle Harris versus Peterson 1. At some point, we might tackle their future debates. So I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this. And as always, you can find me on Twitter at MattKeckBlog. I did remove Twitter from my phone for the short term, because I was too compelled by the riots to just check my phone every 2 minutes to see what new place got set on fire. So I've kind of been on the dark for at least a week or so. And then I know you can find my co-host YouTube is The Anti-Philosopher, and you can you can watch the podcast on YouTube and then see how my hair is about 4 months overgrown at this point due to the quarantine, and how I'm slowly turning into a homeless person. Yeah, anything you wanted to add before I sign off?
Well, if we're talking about hair, I think I have far crazier hair than you do, so I think I wiped the floor there.
Yeah, I was always my friends always give me a hard time for how overgrown and fluffy and curly my hair can get, and then I met you, and it's like, okay, I don't have to worry about that in our conversations. Okay, but to thank everybody for listening. Signing off, it's Matt and Matt.